Thank you, everyone. I have the honor today to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Kathleen Quinlan. Dr. Quinlan is Associate Professor in Higher Education and Director of the Center for Study for Higher Education at the University of Kent in the United Kingdom. She holds a PhD in Education from the Stanford School of Education and has researched teaching and learning in higher education for more than 20 years. She has led educational development programs at the Australian National University, Cornell University's College of Veterinary Medicine, and the University of Singapore, as well as the University of Oxford. She has published more than 30 peer-reviewed journal articles and 7 book chapters. She has also been recognized for her strategic contributions to teaching enhancement with the award of Principal Fellowship of the Higher Education Academy. The title of her keynote address today is Leading for Learning, Building on Your Values and Teaching Expertise. Kathleen, welcome to Stellenbosch University. We look forward to hearing from you.
Goeiemorgen. No, not exactly. Goeiemorgen. Molweni, good morning. It's an honor to be here with you, and it's such a delight to see so many colleagues out for this event. I have to say, I organized the Learning and Teaching Conference at my university, and I would be delighted to see so many people at it. So I'm going to use this opportunity to learn some lessons from my colleagues here about how to make such a successful conference. So I'm going to begin my talk today by telling you a story. I want to tell you about Louisa. Louisa is a participant in a study that I'm doing with colleagues at the moment on leadership, educational leadership, particularly at the program level, at the program leadership level. So Louisa is an academic at a research-intensive university in the UK, and she teaches and does research in Catalan, which is a minority European language that's spoken in Catalonia, which is in the northeast region of Spain. And so I'm telling you this story so that you can be listening to it for signs of educational leadership as a way of constructing, if you will, a definition of educational leadership amongst us. So when she writes about her work and she talks about her work, what we hear is this passion that underlies her work as a teacher. She says, "My love of languages and my pride in belonging to a very small diaspora of UK-based Catalans ensure that the students get the benefit of having direct contact with someone who has become an ambassador for her own native culture. This not only offers me the chance to put a stop to the othering of my people, but empowers students to apply those insights to any other minority culture in which they become interested." So she's published on modern Catalan, particularly around poetry and theater and its connections to other art forms. And as part of this small diaspora of Catalans in the UK, she's also served as external examiner for many of the UK's leading programs in Catalan. Over a 6-year period, she's organized and motivated a productive staff team to develop the Department of Hispanic Studies from being simply a language supplier, offering just an options course as part of a larger Spanish course, to one that's providing full honors degrees in Catalan, master's programs, and even a doctoral program. And in order to support that, she's managed, trained, and mentored lectoras that have been funded by the Catalan autonomous government. And she's also used her contacts to develop exchange programs and collaborations with both the Catalan and Valencian autonomous governments, and brings in guest speakers regularly and organizes study tours. So with that, I would ask you to think about, is Louisa a leader? I'll just have you turn to your neighbor here. Okay. There are many ways to skin a cat here. This is the moment when you are turning to your neighbor and you're discussing how and why Louisa is a leader. Okay, that's a good start, and now my slides are working too. So that's a good way to make that happen. So I want to tell you also what I didn't tell you before, which is that Louisa also happens to be the Associate Dean for Education in the Faculty of Humanities at her university. And on the way to this position, she served in a variety of formal leadership roles, including serving as head of her department, as director of graduate studies, both in her department and across her faculty. But I didn't tell you that before, because often we tend to think about educational leadership in managerial terms. We tend to think of people who have formal positions of authority as leaders. And we also have a tendency, I've discovered in some universities, to have a distrust of leadership when applied to higher education. I think that's because we have such a strong tradition of collegiality, of self-regulation, of autonomy, and a culture in which academic leaders are tended to be treated as sort of a first among equals. So we have a kind of reluctance, I think, to claim the title of leader for ourselves and to own that as part of our identity. And in fact, if we look at some formal definitions of leadership, we see these kinds of emphasis on these more managerial tones and approaches, and they can sometimes look like a sort of hero at the top of an organization who's charging ahead in a very planned way toward clear, predetermined outcomes, which can feel uncomfortable, I think, and sit uncomfortably in higher education. And so that was why I wanted you to think about Louisa's other attributes before we moved on to the formal roles. And so before we look at my own educational leadership framework, I want to situate that more broadly in a different kind of conception of leadership, one that's referring to distributed leadership, which has been a much more appealing notion, has proven to be a much more appealing notion in higher education, because it focuses our attention more on influence and direction, not necessarily with predetermined, agreed strategic outcomes that we're working toward, but one that might have more dialogic processes or that enables more of an emergent direction from a group. And this kind of leadership also then encompasses thought leadership, which we're really good at, and networking, which we're also really good at as academics. So it's about having good ideas and engaging colleagues with those ideas and using one's networks to stimulate debate and change. So it involves many people rather than just a select few, and can be seen rather more as a byproduct of shared activity or discussion and dialogue, not just as a process of one person delegating to others. So basically, I'm suggesting that we take a more inclusive conception of leadership, and in some earlier work of mine, I've defined it more broadly as about having a vision, bringing others along with us through a series of actions. A former colleague of mine at Oxford University took this even one step further. She was at the time a research fellow, in effect something not quite a postdoc, but a little bit beyond that. And she had been organizing a network, a forum within her school and within her a division that was about providing better career development support for research-only staff, for early career academics in particular, early career researchers. And so she sees leadership as rather being much more research-driven, which was the approach she took, was to build on research about early career researchers, and seeing it about networking and bringing people together. So she's describing as saying that What seems to matter in such activity is not, quote, leading people towards given objectives, but actively engaging with colleagues in a process of critical questioning, and then of mobilizing the knowledge, practices, and resources available to enable the generation of new and creative developments. So that's an even more bottom-up view of leadership. And so that really leads us to saying, okay, how are you, each one of you in this room, a leader? As researchers, we have visions and ideas, and we want to contribute to a broader change in our fields or possibly in a wider community of beneficiaries. We are the ones who are choosing the questions and seeking out and finding and then disseminating those answers. When we write a paper even, we're putting out a thesis to be read by others with the hope of influencing future research. That sounds like leadership to me. As teachers, we have authority. We make choices about who to teach, what not to teach, how to teach it, how to assess whether students have met that standard. So we are, whether we're aware of it or not, role models for our students. Day after day, we're standing up in front of 50, 100, 500, maybe it's 1,000 for you, students, young people who are at critical stages in their own identity development. And we're showing them new perspectives on their world, and we're teaching them new ways to make sense of that world. That sounds like leadership to me. So as researchers, as teachers, as colleagues, as mentors, and yes, some of us, formal leaders, we have a vision. And we invite others to share that vision, and we work toward it through a series of actions. Or if we use Wunsch's words, we're involved with colleagues in processes of critical questioning, mobilizing knowledge and other resources to generate something new. So each of us are leaders. And what this means for us is that practically these actions of leadership can take place at various levels, from the micro level of chairing a meeting or leading a seminar, to a more meso level, which might be the course or program level, to a macro level where we might be in a position to influence a whole faculty, university, field, or school. So in this next section, I want to turn to a framework of leadership I developed out of a synthesis of research on leadership. And at the center of this leadership, what I was aiming for is trying to understand how we need to lead in order to promote not just student learning narrowly defined, but when I say student learning at the center here, what I mean is learning in its very broadest sense. Not just acquiring knowledge or building skills, both of which are important and part of it, but also the whole process of developing students as people. And I have called this holistic student development. So it's about helping students to realize their potential as people and perhaps as future leaders in their own careers, communities, professions. So the framework represents three key ingredients, or pillars, if you will, that are the foundation for enabling that kind of holistic learning. Learning that helps students in their process of becoming themselves, building their own sense of identity, and building their own sense of purpose. And these pillars are situated, of course, within wider external conditions. So I'm going to start in the bottom right-hand corner with you, the leader, the person, because academic work is a highly values-based activity, and our actions as teachers, researchers, mentors, colleagues are rooted in our values. So these values are what allow us to create our visions as leaders, and they then support our sense of purpose, and they support us in our continued ongoing and sustained commitment to action over time, because that's often what leadership involves. We benefit from critical self-reflection both in the process of identifying our values and also in the process of monitoring the extent to which we're authentically embodying those values on a day-to-day basis. In the face of competing values or demands, are we reflecting our core purpose in a given action? Who do we want to be, and are we furthering this purpose as we go about our day-to-day activities? This kind of intentionality and authenticity has also been shown to be vital in that process of bringing other people along with us in our vision. So values like this are not the sort of thing you just walk over to the library and you check out like a book. There's something that comes much more deeply from within and from ourselves. And they're the sort of foundation that will continue to sustain us through thick and thin. So how is it that we identify those values? How do we clarify our own sense of purpose? And one of the things that I've found through a recent project that I've been working on, which has focused on emotions in learning and teaching, is that emotions can be a useful guide to us. They can be a compass. And I'm very well aware as I stand up here, we tend not to in academia talk as much about either values or emotions. Now I'm really out in left field on you here by saying we're going to talk about emotions for a minute. But really, it is these emotions that can guide us. So if you find yourself feeling frustrated, that's often because we are being thwarted in some goal that matters to us. What is it that makes us feel angry? That'll be also a clue about something we care deeply about. What is it that makes us most excited or proud or feeling triumphant or excited? That tells us something about who we are and what matters to us. So we can also look at our disciplines. We've chosen our disciplines for reasons. It resonates with us in some way. And disciplines also have values that are embedded in them. So we can kind of look to those and identify what are those sorts of values that are embedded there. And we can also look at various frameworks of professional ethics or frameworks of ubiquitous moral concerns, or look to our own faith traditions. And often when we look at the examples, and I'm going to give you a few examples of values and how that's motivated academic leadership, you'll often hear all three of those things. You'll hear the emotions, the passion, you'll hear the disciplinary connection, and you'll also see that they're consistent with these broader statements of professional values or ubiquitous values. So I'm going to tell you about Catherine. So Catherine is drawn from the same study that Louisa is drawn from. And she gets excited when she talks about her work as a teacher in criminology. When she talks about the importance of experiential learning and the ways in which that can be transformative for students. Those are the kinds of words and linkages she makes, is experiential learning and transformative learning. So in her program in criminology, she has gotten training in a national program called the Inside Out program. That Inside Out program is a national movement in criminal justice education that has, the leader of that movement, the founder of it, has described it as an exchange, an engagement between and amongst people who live on both sides of the prison wall. So what she does is takes university students to the local prison, and she has a class of 15 university students learning alongside 15 prisoners. And so her students are providing an academic perspective on criminology, and the prisoners are providing a lived experience of the criminal justice system. And they are exchanging and learning together through this program. We can go back to Louisa. Louisa, I said, starts with and ends with her love of languages and the love of her own native culture, the Catalanian culture. And she wants to preserve that culture. Her research reflects this in the way in which she's blending the arts and literature, and her teaching reflects this. And the value that she expresses related to this, not just the love of her language, but what she's able to do is to see how that connects more broadly, to say that if they understand and appreciate that culture, then what she hopes is that they will use those insights to study other minority cultures. But she also demonstrates a critical reflection on this core purpose, that notion of critical reflectivity that needs to go along with strongly held values. And she says, I've noticed both how the teaching of Catalan language and culture has often suffered because of its inward perspective and its lack of integration into the international arena. So this is the puzzle she puts forward, the concern that she has behind even this thing she feels very strongly about. And she further writes, she explains how the experience of using minority cultures to tap issues of self-identification within and without colonial powers prompted me to create a new course in collaboration with a Latin American studies colleague. So she's looking at a course in Barcelona and Havana. Sounds interesting. And she's using, as well, exploring new technologies as a way of trying to open up her teaching and expose that, break out of that inwardness that she's concerned about. So she's not only demonstrating that strong core value, but the critical reflectivity that goes with it. And other disciplines also have values that are associated with them. I did a study of the UK Quality Assurance Benchmark Statements, which basically are statements that capture what should be taught as in a given field, and that's used as part of the quality assurance system across the UK. And to my knowledge, these are the only kind of curriculum standards for a field that have been written. So I think they're a very interesting kind of document. They were developed by a whole team of academics in each discipline for their own discipline with very widespread consultation. And as I did content analyses of these, I often found that the values of the disciplines were coming out. And they didn't tend to come out in this generic statements of learning objectives. They often came out in the preambles to the statements. And so just as an example, in the biological sciences, what I was seeing coming through was an awareness of the tentativeness of scientific findings. And this was connected with an awareness that the knowledge base is rapidly growing and changing. And that what this means is that students really have to learn how to learn. And they also have to be very critical of the findings that we know even today. There was also a real strong awareness, it seemed to me, of the consequences of biological knowledge for health and for the environment, and the ethical dilemmas that were associated with the use of scientific knowledge. And what this led me to see was not only this tentativeness associated with the knowledge, but a humility in the face of this knowledge and the power of this knowledge. And I saw that as kind of permeating that field. So we can also look to our own disciplines. And then I want to give you just one more example of not just professing a value, but of living it. So I was working on a project last year on our campus, and what I was trying to identify was a framework of powerful student learning experiences, of a set of principles that would ensure that students would have powerful experiences. So one of the ways that I approached this was I literally walked up to students in public places on campus, and I had a team of research assistants helping me with this, and just started asking students randomly whom I met to talk about a powerful learning experience. So one woman I walked up to turned out to be a second-year female social work student. She was of traditional age, about 19 years old, and she was of African heritage, Black British. She looked, I have to say, a little bit wary when I approached her and I introduced myself, but she was willing to answer my question. And so I asked her, I said, what's been your most powerful learning experience here at Kent? And she told me about how one of her first-year lecturers forced students to work together in class with people who were dissimilar to them. She said she had been used to, quote, being with her own people, and she didn't expect to mingle with others. And she said, well, it was pretty uncomfortable at first, and she thought everyone was uncomfortable working with someone who was different than them. And, but the teacher had explained to them why they needed to do this. That as a social worker, it was a vital professional skill that they be able to interact with someone who was of a different racial background, a different socioeconomic background, a different age than they were. And so she's now embracing this idea. Now, I don't know who this teacher was, somebody in the social work program. I would like to meet her, because she wasn't just paying lip service to stated values like widening participation, or of diverse learning communities, or of equal opportunity, or even of her professional standards. She was embedding this. She was finding ways on a day-to-day level of making that a reality in her class, even when her students were uncomfortable, even when she walked into a room where naturally the black students sat over here and the white students sat over there. So this takes not only commitment, but it takes a bit of courage. It might just want a moment. There we go. So it's now your turn. So I'd like you to just grab a piece of paper. You've all got one in front of you, I know you do, and a pen. And take a moment to do just some free writing. Just give me a sense of what are the key values that underpin your academic practice. What motivates you? What gets you out of bed in the morning and keeps you coming to work, smiling day after day, or working hard through the weekend, as I expect you do, the same as I do. Just a moment or two. Jot down a few notes. Okay. So if we go back to this framework, we've talked a lot about your values and the importance of leaders embracing those values authentically. The second pillar I want to touch on is about having a knowledge of learning and teaching. So values are important, but they're not enough. We also have to understand some of the techniques, some of the methods that allow us to support student learning and holistic development. Now, it may be that if you're leading a company that sells rubber or steel, you don't necessarily need to know how steel is made. You may not necessarily have had to have factory floor or foundry floor experience. But I am arguing in this framework that it is important that we know something about teaching and learning if we're going to create these kinds of environments. And it's also not enough just to know your subject well. In the primary and secondary school leadership literature, this is emphasized. There was a terrific paper that I came across that really did an analysis of the transformative leaders, which is largely what I've been focusing on in describing the values-based leadership, versus what they called instructional leadership models. And they were finding that instructional leadership models were more connected, more highly connected to positive learning outcomes on the part of students. And so what that basically means is that department heads, they were talking about that level of leadership, who got involved in instructional development activities alongside the teachers in their departments and their schools by taking part in professional development opportunities, by visiting classrooms and reviewing data about student performance. So really hands-on looking at the techniques and methods of teaching and learning as a colleague with their colleague. And so we know a lot about the kinds of teaching methods that promote learning and that promote this kind of holistic development. So we know that when we engage students in active learning, that's more effective than just listening and watching experts work. We know that engaging them in complex and authentic contexts is effective, both for problem solving and traditional academic skills and knowledge, but also even more so for developing this kind of moral thinking and social development. So giving students experience, an opportunity to reflect on that, and opportunities to discuss it with peers and with more experienced mentors and teachers. Practice, 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 and getting feedback on that practice are all important to promoting learning of all kinds, particularly this more holistic learning. And in our examples from Louisa and in our example of Catherine, both of these and our example of the social work teacher who forced her students to mingle, all of them were building on and developing their own skills in teaching and learning. For Louisa, it was more technology-based approaches that allowed her to be more outward-looking and collaborative. For Catherine, it was the training program on the Inside Out program for criminology, and that were important to developing their practice, enabling them to lead effectively. And the last part of the model, or the third dimension of the model, which is shown here at the top of the diagram, is around creating the organizational conditions that enable these kinds of rich teaching and learning methods to flourish. And so in this picture, what you have is a table laid out that looks very welcoming and very inviting. The person who's hosting this dinner party has taken a lot of care in creating an environment, an ambiance, in which the kind of socializing that they want to have happen will take place. And likewise, we are creating conditions in which learning can happen and effective teaching can happen. I've relied heavily on Larry Braskamp's work that has led to this framework of what he calls the 4 C's, culture, curriculum, co-curriculum, and community, as being the key things that institutions that are especially dedicated to holistic student learning think about and pay attention to. So in these institutions, there's a shared sense of institutional mission that's evident in the repetition of key phrases across the whole community that describe who they are and what they're there for. So just as an example, enter to learn, depart to serve. Imagine if everybody in your university, from the food service workers in the cafeterias to the vice chancellor, all embraced that idea, repeated that, had a shared sense of that's why they were there. That creates a real sense of community, and it can then permeate across the entire culture of the institution. Other examples were, we exist for students and for learning. These campuses all had programs of induction and ongoing professional development for staff. And they also offered curricula with opportunities such as first-year seminars and final-year projects. And the co-curriculum was seen as supporting students to engage in supplemental or non-credit-bearing activities that connected and extended those core curricula and that were aligned with this larger overall institutional mission that was shared and understood at all levels. Now, the Braskamp example looked at whole campuses, and I want to bring that down to more of a meso level to the program level. So in a smaller scale study that I published earlier this year, my colleagues and I were looking at what program leaders did, particularly program leaders of 2 brand new interdisciplinary master's programs. So they were building these programs from the ground up. And so we looked at what were these leaders doing that enabled this to happen. And we found that they tended to line up and support the right people they talked about, and other members of their team talked about these as being important parts of the development process. Lining up and supporting the right people to lead particular modules and courses, setting up appropriate communication structures, encouraging pilot studies, looking for evidence to base their decision-making on, creating forums then for sharing learning and the results of pilots, creating forums for cross-course collaboration, seeking evidence about what's working, so they were very, very thoughtful in their evaluation designs. And what they did was focus throughout on the outcomes, student learning outcomes. And they used that as a key guide for themselves when when they couldn't resolve matters through consensus. And they had to take difficult decisions. And they did have to occasionally make those difficult calls. They've worked very hard at creating a learning culture within their teams. And they brought in educational development specialists to work with teachers across the program to build skills and awareness of those outcomes. They took a non-defensive attitude. They were really inclusive in working with all staff and emphasizing human processes. So at the MISO level, in this research-intensive university where this was carried out, which was also a collegial university, the key role of leaders was, in fact, to create the right conditions so the entire team could best serve students and their growth. In a more recent project I've been working in a more managerial university, there's been some question about the extent to which one can actually create the organizational conditions necessary. And there's more of an appearance that the environment is more bureaucratic and tightly constrained. And obviously, in such an environment, academic autonomy can be more restricted, and it may be more difficult to maneuver. So we've been starting to think a little bit more about leadership development, more as a process of expanding one's own sphere of influence, recognizing that that is not an infinite expansion, but it's an expansion within a set of constraints, and to be seeing what is possible even within existing structures and policies. And so this might mean just doing the best one can within existing sort of walls and ceilings, if you will, redecorating and renovating perhaps, rather than building a new building. And an example is Louisa, who we've seen her throughout this talk. She was on a teaching scholarship contract, which basically means that she's not supported and funded to do research in a traditional sense. Her work is mainly on teaching. And she agreed to that kind of contract term on the condition that she would be able to take study leave. But then when she applied for study leave, it was not granted. And so she felt, I think, a bit like she was working in this sort of environment. But with a bit of mentoring, she was able to recast that same application to show how it would benefit her teaching work and her leadership in her teaching, and then it was granted. So she was able to redecorate a bit the space that she was in, and still able then to maneuver in the right direction. So this last point highlights that much depends upon this larger external conditions within which leaders are operating. These kinds of external conditions and these broader contexts may be supportive of our core values, or they may be less supportive. In increasingly managerial environments, such as those that we're facing in the UK, this can sometimes create value conflicts for individuals. I think that makes it all the more important that we reflect on our values and take nurturance from those values. So I'm not going to attempt to situate the principles in your local context. Instead, tomorrow, your colleague Magda Fure-Malerba will be giving the keynote, and she's going to be focusing much more on leadership in the local context, and also giving you some findings from a local study of leadership. But my framework acknowledges that there's a historical, cultural, and economic context that needs to be taken into account. But the messages of focusing on learning, that of the holistic development of students, and the maintenance of a core set of values, looking for ways to create organizational conditions, and basing that upon our expertise in learning and teaching are all still sound principles that can be applied and adapted in a variety of settings. So the particular ways that you practice leadership will, of course, vary. But in this challenging time, leadership from across the academy, from each one of you, not just from those few who are at the top, are vital. They're vital to shaping the programs that I know you have in renewal. They're vital to reshaping your university and its education, to higher education in South Africa more broadly, and ultimately to your country. So, thank you, dankie, and kosi.
Thank you very much for an insightful and thought-provoking presentation. I think many aspects of your presentation are applicable to our context here at Stellenbosch University. The concept of distributed leadership, having a vision, building others, bringing others along with us through a series of actions. The concept of research-driven leadership is also a key notion. And then accessing and embedding emotions and values in an academic context, and improving knowledge of learning and teaching. Finally, creating organizational conditions that allow for rich teaching and learning to flourish. I was very interested in the 4 C's. I think the concepts of culture, curriculum, co-curriculum, and community are those which are held very dear at Stellenbosch University. So thank you very much for your input. And we'd like to open the floor for questions. We have 15 minutes for questions. There's a roving mic, which will be used.
Questions?
Thank you very much for an excellent presentation. I want to pick your brain a bit on how one can go about mediating what in the literature, of course, on leadership is quite clear, but I think is very prevalent in our context as well. And that is the tension, I won't go so far as say the conflict, but the tension between highly transformative forms of leadership and distributed leadership. So if we take transformative leadership as really drawing on personal values, as informing that model of leadership, but at the same time we acknowledge that in the university context, it's a complex, highly messy environment that really calls for distributed forms of leadership. How do we really bring those two together if we're finding increasingly that we're in a pluralist environment, and that we really want to encourage and embrace that kind of pluralist perspective where we cannot assume that values will be shared in any form at a personal level. So I'm quite interested to hear from you, how can we mediate that kind of tension? Thanks.
Yeah. I think that's where Alice Awansha, I told you, my colleague, by describing it as a process of critical questioning, I think that's a really useful way of moving us toward that more pluralist direction. And I think that within that, there is room to find shared ground, even whilst respecting differences. And often even when I think about the program leaders that I was working with in the project a few years ago, there was a very big and broad vision for the programs. And that was something that in fact it was relatively easy for people to embrace. And even underneath that, it's only when you get down beneath that, that's where the squabbles start to happen. And so I think that part of the effective leadership is to keep calling people up to the shared ground, to keep finding that point of common resonance. And that's a way that we can mediate the day-to-day and keep bringing people onto the same, rowing in the same direction. Does that help? Great. I think you had a hand here. You can't take it.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks very much for the presentation.
Yeah.
Mine is just actually not more on the sort of academic, but more on the co-curricular side in the student communities, where actually one, find himself in actually being in a position where you still want to instill leadership within the community, but somehow there is no correlation that one can draw between the academic and the student communities. How does one actually try and merge the two and make sure that learning still happens in the student communities and there is still leadership that's actually demonstrated in those ones? You don't look in a residence as a space just to put your head and sleep and then wake up and go to classrooms.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
So if we go back to the Larry Braskamp's campuses that he studied, this idea of living and learning in community was really central in all of these places that he visited and researched. And so you're, I think, absolutely right to be reminding us that the co-curricular environment and the residential environment is a very powerful part of the educational environment that we're creating. And so part of what we need to do, perhaps, are to find forums or make forums. So much of this, if we go back to the creating organizational conditions, it's about creating forums where we can build collaboration between the curriculum and the co-curriculum. And I think it's really useful to point that out. So often when we talk about teaching and learning, and even have a conference like this of social, we often shift ourselves into the academic environment, the formal curricular side, and forget that actually so much of what students are learning is happening outside of the classroom itself. And how do we make that broader environment supportive of the kind of visions that we have? Thank you. Any other questions?
Just a quick question. I don't know anything about leadership, but I watched a TED Talk the other day. And in the TED Talk...
That's how we all learn, isn't it? Woo.
And in the TED Talk, they said that leadership of the future is defined by 3 questions. 1, where do you look to prepare for disruptions? 2, how diverse are your conversations?
How
diverse are your conversations?
Yeah.
And 3, are you willing to stop doing what has worked in the past? And I want to know whether you believe that is true for education, teaching and learning, and if so, what are some of the disruptions that we need to prepare for, and what is some of the new thinking to get us into a new space?
Yeah, you gotta love TED Talks. So I'm a little hesitant about abandoning everything that's worked before. I'm a little hesitant in the sense that we actually know a lot about learning and teaching that's accumulated from decades of research on what supports student learning. Now, it's true that we don't always put that into practice, so we still may need to change, but it isn't because what we need to change is what's worked, what's shown to work, but rather it may be that we're not doing those things already. So I'd have some hesitation about that piece of it. Yeah. But thinking about disruptions does, I think, help shake us out of our current environment and cause us to perhaps generate those new opportunities, new ideas that are connected, that are at the heart of leadership. So, yeah. Thank you. Other questions, comments, items you wish to take issue with? I think we're very close on to the end of the hour. So danke. And enjoy the conference. I'm looking forward to the sessions.
Thank you. Kathleen, thank you very much for your input. And we have a small token of our appreciation to thank you for giving the keynote address today. Many thanks.